The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. From security and trade relationships in the South to a diplomatic standoff punctuated by occasional crises in the North, policymakers in Washington and Seoul manage a complex constellation of issues on the Korean Peninsula. To provide an update on where things stand and some thoughts on what may lie ahead in U.S.-Korean relations, we're pleased to be joined by Jang Hyun Kim, Counselor for Trade at the Economic Section of the Embassy of the Republic of Korea, where his portfolio includes implementation of the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement. Michael Clausen, Democratic People's Republic of Korea Unit Chief in the U.S. Department of State's Office of Korean Affairs, and Troy Stangarone, Senior Director of Congressional Affairs and Trade at the Korea Economic Institute of America, a U.S. nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting dialogue between the U.S. and the Republic of Korea on economic, political, and security issues. Well, welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I wonder if we could just start out with sort of a fast recounting of recent history on the peninsula. Let's start with basically post-World War II. We have the famous division by the UN at the 38th parallel. Anyone want to jump in and set the stage for us?
Yeah, well, at the conclusion of World War II, as you noted, Korea was divided. And there was an effort actually to try to reunify the peninsula then. The original plan was to set up, have essentially provisional governments. They would arrange for elections on both sides, and then the Korean people would choose essentially, how to go forward. Needless to say, that did not happen. And we've, this year is actually the 70th anniversary of the division of the peninsula. So, while Germany 25 years ago finally reunified, we're still waiting for unification on the Korean peninsula today.
And what was the U.S. interest in being involved at that point?
Well, I think that the U.S. has had a long-standing interest in Asia for a number of different reasons, both on the security and economic front. At that time, of course, the security relationship was probably the most important facet. And I would say that the alliance structure that came into effect after the close of World War II is in many ways to thank for a lot of the economic prosperity that we are able to see today in Asia.
But like many things of that era, it really was largely driven by Cold War concerns, wasn't it?
In some ways it was. There were certainly many concerns about a rising Soviet Union, and then of course later China and Vietnam, of course.
So, Councilor Kim, talk a little bit about what the state of Korean economy and society was in that sort of immediate post-World War II era, 1950s.
1950s, well, as you might know, after the liberation of the Korean Peninsula, the peninsula was divided in North and South, and we had the country called the Republic of Korea, which I'm from, in southern part of the peninsula, and DPRK in the northern part. And on the June 25th, 1950, there was a war ignited by the North Korean aggression into the south, and the country was totally devastated, and South Korea was totally outpowered by the North Korean armed forces. And at that moment, the United States intervened and formed the United Nations force and sent hundreds of thousands of troops to help us push back the North Korean invaders. And as a result, the entire peninsula was, just turned into rubbles.
So a little bit later in the Park Chung-hee era, we have something called the Miracle on the Han River. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, basically, the miracle of Han River is sort of partly is partly the result of the state-driven market economy, as you can see in China today, and partly by the generous assistance from the Western world, headed by the United States. At that time, the United States initiated South Korea into the the Western market economy, so that the country can stand up on its own legs. And at the same time, the government led by President Park Chung-hee, he pursued sort of a centralized economy. Government plans everything that we should manufacture this sort of products, and then we should do this and do that. Well, and as a result, we achieved a certain economic miracle.
So talk a little bit about sort of the social conditions driving that.
Well, at the time, essentially North and South Korea were still at loggerheads. There was concerns that there could be a second Korean War, but more specifically, the government, be it Park Chung-hee or others, realized that the only way to take and deter the North ultimately, and to build up a strong enough military in the South to do that, was to develop the economy. So you had this sense of a society that understood, and that perhaps to a degree felt an under siege mentality, that without economic development, you wouldn't be able to take and defend yourself against the North. So what we saw was actually very rapid movement to industrialization. A couple sort of interesting points at that time was that South Korea had approached the United States and the World Bank about setting up a steel factory. And both the U.S. and the World Bank had said, listen, Korea is not at a point to where it's ready to do this kind of thing. And ultimately Park Chung-hee pushed forward, and we have POSCO today, which is sort of an example of South Korea's industry and industrious nature and their own ability to take and sort of overcome great odds. But when we look sort of at the situation, I think one of the things that a lot of times we sort of lose track of, especially today when you look back or even talk about sort of the modern global economy, is that much of this was made possible because of South Korea's export-oriented policies. And that was only made possible because the United States and other countries opened their markets to South Korean goods. So we often talk about the downsides of trades, but we sometimes forget that many of the economic miracles we've seen, be it either the miracle in the Han or in other countries, are made possible because of the openness of free trade.
I would just add to that it's really a nice example of sort of the power of shared ideals. In the beginning, it wasn't entirely clear which was going to be more successful, the North or the South. But of course, South Korea, with strong alignment with the United States on issues like democracy, free trade, human rights, turned out to be, in the end, many, many, many times much more successful than the North.
And actually, up until about the 70s, the North Korean economy was larger than the South Korean economy. So for an early period, at least, the North was actually winning the economic race.
So this is very much your portfolio. This is what busies you every day in your office. So talk a little bit about what kinds of choices were being made in the North. We talked about an orientation towards export-driven economy and open markets, that sort of thing. What do the conversations sound like in the North?
Well, at that time, I think that the focus was very much on what they called a military-first policy. What we've seen that evolve into over time is the policy that is currently in place, which is sort of a dual-track policy, one that says the North Koreans are going to focus both on the development of their nuclear and ballistic missile program, as well as developing their economy. This is something we disagree with very strongly. We think that the North Koreans have a choice. When we talk about choices, a choice they need to make. And we remain open to engagement if they're willing to make the correct choice, which is to abandon their nuclear program, focus more on economic development. If they continue this dual-track approach, we feel that it's just going to end in running into a brick wall.
Well, and that desire to acquire nuclear weapons is actually longer than people may think, right? There was an effort to engage the Soviet Union for the transfer of nuclear technology, wasn't there? And later China, both of whom demurred.
Yeah, there's actually some really good work done by Jonathan Pollock at the Brookings Institution, who wrote a book called No Exit. And basically he goes through old Soviet archives and other archives and documents how essentially very early in the regime they were already seeking to try and develop nuclear weapons. So we have this sort of impression because it became sort of onto the scene in the mid to late 90s, the nuclear program. But it's actually a much longer track than many people realize.
So, Councilor Kim, I know you're dealing primarily with trade, but you're have a firsthand sense of this history. How did the regime in the North come to power? I mean, now we've had this hereditary dynasty. How did that come to be?
Well, that's a tricky question. When they first established their country called DPRK or North Korea, whatever you call, they told to the outside world, and of course there are people that we are setting up a sort of a socialist or communist country where workers are the rulers of the country. But as you mentioned, it turned out that the country is run by a certain family called Kims. I mean,
No
Kim
relation.
Oh, actually, my family name is Kim, but I have nothing to do with them. But anyway, but in the end, what we have in North Korea is sort of a dynasty. I mean, passing power from grandfather to, father to son and to the grandson. But so it seems to me that North Koreans have never had a sort of a process of modernization in sense of political activities, because it's just they're just continuing the dynasties we had for thousands of years. So I think that's the main reason they still have this heretic dynasty.
Well, when we come back, I'd like to talk a little bit about sort of the current situation and specifically your portfolio, the Free Trade Agreement. But first, we'll take a short break. We'll be back with more International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Well, welcome back. We're looking at the future of Korea. Well, let's talk a little bit about the current economic relationship. There is the Korea-U.S. Free Trade Agreement, which went into effect in March of 2012. I'll just throw it out to any one of you. And how does this relate to other kinds of free trade agreements in terms of just size, expansiveness, what's covered, what's not?
Well, it's the largest agreement the United States has done in Asia. It's our most advanced free trade agreement. It's essentially the template for much of the talks for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So in many ways, it's a key agreement both for the United States and for South Korea. In terms of what we've seen over the last few years, it's been in effect for 3 years. We have seen trade growth on both sides over that period of time. We have a new level of all-time high in terms of trade between the United States and Korea. When you look at the agreement itself, it has opened up new markets in Korea for U.S. ag producers. There's some things, I know the head of the American Chamber of Commerce in Korea, and she was telling me, before the agreement, you would never see pistachios in Seoul. Now there are kiosks selling pistachios on the streets.
From California.
Yes, from California. So, this is an agreement to where, it's taken and it's sort of changed the nature of trade between the two countries and opened up new markets for both sides.
So it was not without a certain amount of concern on both sides. What were some of the issues for Koreans when the negotiations were going on?
Well, when the negotiations were going on, of course, we had our own portion of people who were against this trade deal, and they argued that once we have this FTA, free trade agreement with the United States, there's going to be this mechanism called investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, which allows foreign investors to challenge the government decisions or measures, not in the host country court, but in the through the international arbitration, and that would undermine our sovereignty. And I guess there were fairly high numbers of Americans are arguing the same point these days. And of course, there was an issue with the automotive trade throughout the negotiations. The American side asked the Korean government to do away with the Korean motor vehicle safety standards, because it stood up as a sort of trade barriers to the American automakers, to their eyes. And it also was received as a sort of insult to our national sovereignty, because we are the one who are living here, and we are to set up whatever safety standards for automobiles. But in the end, we made a compromise so that now after this course FTA, American automakers can sell the American-made motor vehicles to Korea, made under the federal motor vehicle safety standards, which is the American ones, up until the certain amount. So that's a sort of a compromise we had.
And what about agricultural, particularly beef became a big issue?
Well, technically speaking, beef was not part of the FTA negotiations. It had to do with the BSE or
mad cow disease.
Mad cow disease. We have the safety concerns among the Korean consumers, and some people in Korea suspected that the United States is trying to use this FTA with Korea as a tool to further open up its market for U.S. beef, which might be affected by the mad cow disease. That was the crux of the dispute. But in the end, now, aside from the FTA, we have a sort of a protocol between the two governments and, of course, exporters and the importers in both countries, that the U.S., the American side will only export beef from the cattle under the age of 30 months. So, which is scientifically saying that safe from the BSCA contamination. So it's working now.
Well, and in this country, of course, we're very interested in these kinds of bilateral agreements. But talk a little bit about the other agreements that Korea has. I mean, you have a very large number of free trade agreements around the world, don't you?
Yes, we do have free trade agreements. Aside from the United States, there's, a couple of months ago, we initialed the deal with the Chinese, and also we have FTA with the European Union, which is consisted of 27, I think it's 28 member states, right? Mm-hmm. And also we have FTA with the Southeast Asian countries, and also the Southeast Asian bloc called ASEAN, and also with the Chile. So I think we keep working on expand our FTA network.
So let's move a little bit more onto the policy side of this thing. And there was the famous pivot towards Asia on the part of the Obama administration. How is that perceived in the region, do you think? Is this largely in response to what was perceived as a growing Chinese influence in the region, right? So talk a little bit about just how the pivot plays out these years afterwards.
Well, I think, as you pointed out early in President Obama's administration, he believed we needed to rebalance towards Asia, and as a result, we focused more of our resources, whether they're military, economic, or diplomatic, to the area. I would say that the way it's playing out currently is in a couple of interesting ways. From my perspective, the most important is what we call the new normal of high-level engagement with our partners in the Asia-Pacific region. And just as an example, with South Korea, of course, President Obama has made 4 trips to South Korea. We're welcoming President Park later this year to the United States. And so that's been that's had a huge impact on the State Department's work. Is this increased level of activity when it comes to engagement with Asia Pacific?
Do you think this is perceived as being mostly driven by sort of an anti-China policy?
You do hear that a lot, but I think practically speaking, when we look at the region, many of the world's future consumers are going to be in Asia. The world's largest population is Asia. It's the most dynamic growing region in the world, be that, because of China, be that because of Southeast Asia and other parts of Asia. I mean, at the end of the day, be it from an economic perspective, be it from a political perspective, be it from a military perspective, this is going to be, going forward, the most critical area for the United States. And so, obviously a lot of this is wrapped up in that much of the change is being driven by China's own economic development, which is leading to stronger military presence in China, which does make many in the region, nervous. But at the same time, what the U.S. is doing is more focused on, our own interests and is separate from what China is doing itself. And I think, the difficulty with that is that because you have this, rise of a new great power going on at the same time, often there are questions about what are the intentions of each power. But, when we look at something, I think one of the keys to the rebalance is actually the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which we're negotiating right now with many of the countries in the region. And, much of Asia's focus right now is on economic growth, raising living standards, expanding trade. And so, the key way that we engage in the region is going to be through the economic side. And the TPP is going to be a key part of that. And, so when you ask, is this something, or perceived as being a counter to China, I think this is more really an effort to take and engage the region. And the TPP is something which we have said publicly that, China, when it's ready, is welcome to join. And, we're happy to work with China, I think, on a wide range of issues. So I think this is really more about increasing the United States engagement in what's going to be a critical part of the world rather than anything directly related to China.
So,
just to follow up on that very quickly, I think that a lot of people like to pose this as a U.S. versus China issue, but I think generally speaking in the region there's a much more nuanced take, and that countries and governments understand that this isn't a zero-sum game, and that there's plenty of room for increased engagement by both China and the United States.
So, as we wind down here, I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about prospects for reunification. And I'd like to read a quote from President Park. She was in Dresden last year in March, and she said, the images of one Germany encourage those of us in Korea to cement our hope and our conviction that unification must also come on the Korean peninsula. I believe that the Republic of Korea will simply reach ever greater heights after unification. So is this just political rhetoric celebrating German reunification, or do you think this is a process that really has some chance of going forward?
That is a message to our own people in South Korea, because according to a number of public polls, there are growing numbers of young generation in South Korea who are not interested in the reunification or even opposing the idea of reunification, because that would cause more financial burden to them. Because as you can see, when the two Germanys united with each other, the then West Germany had to, they bear lots of financial burdens. And South Koreans in general, and South Korean young generation in particular, is very, very much concerned about these possibilities, because in the end, it's going to be themselves who's going to be paid for the reunification. But as you mentioned, President Park's message is that there's another part of the statement which points out that the reunification of the two Koreas is not just a burden, but it will be a great opportunity for the future generation. So that was the point she wanted to make to the South Korean general.
Well, we've got just about a minute left. How does this play in the North?
Well, let me start off by saying that the United States is completely supportive of President Park's vision for a peacefully reunified Korean peninsula. And frankly, the way this plays out in the North is the same way it plays out with a lot of other issues we see, in that despite President Park's repeated attempts at engagement, the North has generally rebuffed those attempts. There have been some sporadic attempts maybe by the North to engage, but generally speaking, they have remained silent on this issue. And I think at this point, really, the onus is on the North to take up the offer and to begin more serious and credible discussions about this.
Very good. Well, I'll give you the last word. We've got about 30 seconds left. Are we going to have a wider transatlantic partnership?
Transatlantic or Trans-Pacific?
I'm sorry, Trans-Pacific. Well, we're working on the other one, too.
Well, yeah, we are doing both. I do think we will get there. One of the keys is going to be getting a deal with Japan. And I think, once TPP is close to conclusion, I think we'll probably see Korea join as well, either slightly before it ends or just slightly after. But I do think we're going to start to see all this coalesce.
Well, we're going to have to leave it at that. Councillor Kim, Michael Clausen, Troy Stangarone, thank you very much to our viewers. See you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,